September 1945. The war ends, and Britain's most iconic fighter sits idle. Across airfields from Scotland to Malta, thousands of Spitfires stand parked in rows, no longer needed. The aircraft that saved Britain now faces an uncertain future, and what happens next transforms the symbol of victory into scrap metal, foreign exports, and eventually the world's most valuable vintage warbirds. In September 1945, as Japan surrendered, the Royal Air Force faced an overwhelming surplus. At the war's peak, over 20,000 Spitfires had been built. Now, with peace declared, Fighter Command needed only a fraction of that number. Hundreds of squadrons were disbanded within months. Pilots returned to civilian life, and the airfields that once scrambled fighters against the Luftwaffe grew quiet. The numbers were staggering. Over 5,000 Spitfires remained operational or stored across Britain at war's end. Newer variants like the Mark 9, 14 and 18 were still being delivered from Castle Bromwich and Southampton factories, even as the military began cancelling orders. Production lines that had run day and night for 5 years suddenly shut down. Workers who had built Spitfires by the hundreds now faced unemployment. At maintenance units across Britain, Spitfires were parked wingtip to wingtip. Bases like Cologne, Hawarden and Biggin Hill became storage depots. Some aircraft had barely logged flight hours. Others showed the wear of combat operations over Europe. All shared the same problem. The RAF didn't need them anymore, and storing thousands of fighters cost money the post-war government didn't want to spend. The question facing military planners was simple but brutal. What do you do with an icon when the war is over? Within months of victory, Britain's government made a cold calculation. Maintaining thousands of Spitfires served no purpose. The country was broke, cities needed rebuilding, and rationing was still in effect. The decision came quickly. Most Spitfires would be scrapped for their aluminum. Starting in late 1945, disposal operations began across Britain. At airfields like Cosford and Shawbury, ground crews stripped Spitfires of engines, instruments and radios. What remained, the airframes themselves, were crushed, cut apart or bulldozed into piles. The aluminum was valuable. Britain's reconstruction needed raw materials, and melting down fighters provided tons of metal for factories producing civilian goods. Some disposals were particularly shocking. At one site, brand new Spitfire Mark 14, fresh from the factory with minimal flight time, were driven into pits and buried. At coastal locations, airframes were loaded onto barges and dumped at sea. Rows of fighters vanished in weeks, reduced to scrap value measured in pounds sterling per ton. Veterans watched in disbelief. Men who had flown Spitfires in combat saw the aircraft they trusted with their lives treated as surplus junk. Letters to newspapers protested the waste, but the government's position was firm. Sentiment couldn't justify the cost of storage, and Britain needed revenue more than it needed mothballed fighters. Not every Spitfire met the scrapyard. Some served new roles that extended their service life, though often without glory. The RAF kept several hundred for training purposes. These became instructional airframes parked at technical schools where apprentices learned maintenance on real aircraft. Engines were started and stopped, hydraulics tested, and gun systems disassembled, all for education rather than combat. Others became gate guardians. Painted in squadron colours and mounted on pedestals, they stood at airfield entrances as static monuments. Some of these guardians remained in place for decades, weathering through British winters until rust and neglect took their toll. A few survive in museums today, though heavily restored from their years outside. The strangest fate befell Spitfires converted for air racing. With their military equipment removed and engines modified for speed, several competed in post-war races. They flew in bright colours, chasing trophies instead of enemy fighters. These racers drew crowds, but represented a tiny fraction of the total fleet. Most Spitfires never flew again after 1945. While Britain scrapped thousands of Spitfires at home, it sold hundreds more abroad. Foreign air forces, rebuilding after the war or establishing new military branches, saw value in proven British fighters. These export deals provided Britain with much-needed foreign currency and gave the Spitfire a second life under different flags. The largest buyer was India. Newly independent in 1947, India acquired several hundred Spitfire Mark 17s to equip its air force. These aircraft served throughout the late 1940s before being replaced by jets. Some Indian Spitfires survived into the 1950s, flying patrols along disputed borders until spare parts ran out. Egypt, Greece, Turkey and Syria all operated Spitfires in the late 1940s. The aircraft saw combat again during regional conflicts, including the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, where Egyptian Spitfires fought against Israeli fighters. Ironically, both sides flew versions of the same British design, Spitfires facing Spitfires over the Middle East. Southern Rhodesia received Spitfires for training purposes. South Africa operated them briefly before transitioning to jets. Even Burma acquired a small batch for its fledgling air force. These exports scattered Spitfires across continents, where many eventually met the same fate as their British counterparts, scrapped locally when they became too expensive to maintain. France operated Spitfires longer than most. The French Air Force flew Mark 9s and 9s and 9s well into the 1950s, using them for reconnaissance and training missions. When France finally retired them, a few ended up in private hands, becoming some of the earliest civilian-owned Spitfires. By the early 1950s, the Spitfire era had clearly ended. The RAF phased out its remaining operational examples in favor of jets like the Meteor and Vampire. The last Spitfire squadron disbanded in 1954, marking the official end of the type's military service in Britain. What had once been the backbone of fighter command was now a relic, remembered fondly but considered obsolete. The transition happened quickly. Jet engines offered speed and altitude advantages that propeller-driven fighters couldn't match. Air forces worldwide adopted jets, and aircraft like the Spitfire, so dominant just years earlier, became museum pieces or scrap. Most people assumed the Spitfire story had ended, but something unexpected was beginning. In the 1960s and 1970s, a new interest emerged. Aviation enthusiasts and former pilots began searching for surviving Spitfires. What they found shocked them. Intact airframes hidden in barns, forgotten in scrapyards, abandoned at remote airfields, even buried in fields where they'd been dumped decades earlier. The first restorations were small-scale efforts by individuals who refused to let the aircraft disappear. They bought derelict airframes for a few £100s, often little more than a fuselage and wings. Working in garages and workshops, they spent years sourcing parts, rebuilding engines, and restoring aircraft to flying condition. One famous discovery came from a peat bog in Ireland, where a Spitfire had crashed during the war and sunk into soft ground. Decades later, it was excavated, remarkably preserved, and eventually restored. Similar finds occurred across Europe, from Norwegian fjords to French forests. Museums began competing for Spitfires. The Imperial War Museum, the RAF Museum, and private collectors recognized that these aircraft represented more than aviation history. They symbolized Britain's finest hour. Prices climbed. By the 1980s, a complete Spitfire airframe could sell for tens of thousands of pounds. By the 2000s, that figure reached hundreds of thousands. Today, a fully restored, airworthy Spitfire can sell for over £3 million. The aircraft, once sold as scrap for the price of its metal weight, now commands prices comparable to luxury supercars. The transformation is complete, from surplus junk to priceless artifact. In the modern era, Only about 60 Spitfires remain airworthy worldwide. They appear at air shows across Britain, Europe, and North America, thrilling audiences with the sound of their Merlin engines. Charitable organizations like the Spitfire Trust and private collections maintain these aircraft, ensuring they continue flying for future generations. Restoration has become a specialized industry. Engineers spend thousands of hours on each project, sourcing original parts or fabricating replacements to exact specifications. Some restorations combine components from multiple wrecked aircraft to create a single flying example. Every rivet, every panel, every instrument is scrutinized to maintain authenticity. But the question remains, how many Spitfires might still be out there undiscovered? Rumours persist of airframes buried at old RAF stations, hidden in private collections, or resting in remote crash sites. Each discovery adds another chapter to the Spitfire's remarkable post-war story. What survives today is only a tiny fraction of the thousands that once defended Britain. They serve as reminders of how quickly even the most celebrated machines can be forgotten, and how determination and passion can bring them back from the edge of extinction. If you found this video insightful, like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more from Tales of Britain. Thanks for watching.